Hi guys, Anna here with part 3 of my video series on oil painting surfaces. I've already shared some of my favorite kinds of working surfaces and some of the ways I like to doctor them so they're completely customized for the amount of texture and smoothness I'm going for. But in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I prepare a canvas from start to finish using raw linen. And I'll show you 3 different ways to do it. Okay, so here's what you're going to need for preparing your own linen canvases. And I know it's going to seem like a lot of supplies, but once you have everything, it's going to be really nice to have it all in stock, and it should last you a good long time. First off, I like to buy my linen on a big roll. It's usually about 6 yards long, 84 inches high, and you can get it online at places like Jerry's or Dick Blick. Now this is a fine portrait grade weave, but it's unprimed linen, so that means it's raw linen. And that's what I'm looking to use for this particular demonstration. I have another version here. This is much thicker weave, and it has, like if you were to compare this to your sheets, this would have a much lower thread count. So it's going to be more absorbent, and you're going to need more layers of sizing and priming just to make sure that the paint doesn't seep through to the back of your canvas. But sometimes this is kind of nice to have if you want something with a little more texture to it. So I use this pretty regularly. And the third option I have here, this is actually pre-primed linen. You can see it's thicker, more durable. It's got several layers of primer already on it. And this is just nice to have on hand if you want to stretch it right away and attach it to some stretcher bars, and then you can just go ahead and paint on it. It's ready to go. You can also cut out pieces of it, tape it to a board, and then stretch onto stretcher bars after your painting is finished. Or you can cut out a piece and glue it to a panel. But for now, we're just going to work with the raw linen today. You're also going to need some stretcher bars. I have a couple of different kinds. These are actually some Gallery Pro stretcher bars. You can see they're pretty hefty, they're kind of thick, and they have a good lip on the edge here. And that means that when you stretch the canvas across the front, if your canvas is nice and tight and prepared properly, then it won't sink down and touch this inside part of the stretcher bar. Ideally, the only place where your canvas is touching is just at the very far corner of the stretcher bar. So for larger canvases, definitely go with the heavier duty stretcher bar. Ideally, anything bigger than, say, like a 24 by 30 would have also a T-bar or a cross brace attached to it. But for today, I'm just going to use these larger stretcher bars to make a 24 by 30. You can also get these smaller stretcher bars readily available at places like Hobby Lobby, and these are much thinner, as you can see, and they have this kind of softer, more brittle wood. So you want to be careful when you choose these kinds of stretcher bars. They're cheap and available, but they're cheap and available. So make sure when you select them from the store, they're not warped in any way, they're nice and straight, and they're not broken at the edges or the corners here. And I recommend these for much smaller canvases. So I'm going to demonstrate today using a larger canvas with those heavier duty stretcher bars and a smaller canvas with these smaller ones here. I'm also going to show you how to mount raw linen to a board. And this is a Richardson Premium Artist hardboard. It's just a piece of wood that's been finely sanded and cut to size, and this is just a standard 16 by 20. But because it's unprimed, I'll show you how you can size a board like this to prepare it for having raw linen mounted to it and sized and primed properly so that it can be a beautiful working surface to paint on. So those are going to be my 3 demonstrations for today. I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of all the details and the little things that I've learned along the way, so I hope you enjoy. In addition to linen and stretcher bars, I'm also using a drop cloth or cardboard sheets to protect the floor, rabbit skin glue, a straight edge or square, a rubber mallet, a staple gun, mine is called an easy tacker, a pair of pliers. Primers of choice, I have golden GAC100, which is my acrylic polymer, some lead ground and some oil-based ground, a putty knife or large palette knife, a couple of 2-inch chip brushes, one for my size and one for my primer, a charcoal pencil, some fine-tooth sandpaper, scissors, Gamsol for thinning your primer if need be and for cleanup, paper towels, rubber gloves, and an X-Acto knife. Welcome to my kitchen. I have here some rabbit skin glue, and this is actually in, it comes in two different formats. So it can come in like a powder form, or it can come in this kind of granular format, which is what I have here. RSG is just another name for hide glue. So it's not necessarily made from rabbits. It might also be made from the bones and the hides of cows usually, or other animals that end up being used for food. So kind of when this stuff was invented, they would eat a lot of rabbits, and so they would utilize the entire body of the animal. So that's just kind of some background there. Generally, I just follow the instructions on the package. There's going to be a lot more water than glue, so the ratio on this package says 1 part glue to 10 parts water. So that's what I'm going to do. And I like to make smaller batches at a time unless I'm planning to do a whole bunch of canvases all at once, because it doesn't last super long. You can store it in your fridge for up to 2 weeks and then reheat it, but generally it doesn't last any longer than that. If it starts to smell really bad, then you know it's not good anymore. And at that point it's deteriorating and it's losing its qualities as a glue. So I also have here a double boiler. This is helpful to make sure that your glue does not get too hot. So let's go ahead and make a batch. All right, we're gonna cover it up and let it sit overnight or for about 8 hours. And once it's gotten to a gel, then that's when we'll heat it up and it'll be ready for using as our size. All right, while we wait for that RSG to set, we can go ahead and build our stretcher braces for our canvases. So I have some heavier duty stretcher bars here. I'm gonna make a 24 by 30, and then I'm gonna make kind of an odd size with some smaller stretcher bars. This is going to be a 12 by 18. And they come with these nice little notches in them, ready to go. You can start by just lining them up. You don't need to get them in all the way because that's what our rubber mallet is for. Okay. I'm going to grab my mallet and just gently tap these in. If you go too hard, chances are the wood is going to split, so be really careful when doing this. And you'll notice I'm working on the floor. Some people, to protect their backs, will use a table or a flat working surface where you don't have to be on the floor. I just like to spread out because I have a lot more space down here. Okay, that's pretty good. Just want to make sure that there aren't any corners jutting out further than another corner. This is a little bit on this side. Alright, so all the corners are pretty much flush at this point. Next I want to make sure that it's square. So I'm going to grab my square here and line it up, and if it's not completely flush, I can just gently push that stretcher bar in so that it lines up with the square. And I want to check all 4 sides. Okay, that's pretty good. Now if you're worried about these smaller stretcher bars getting out of joint once the size is applied to the canvas and once you start stretching it, because there's going to be quite a bit of pressure applied to the canvas, you can always take your stapler and reinforce the corners just a little bit. Okay, so that's that one. Let's do this big one next. And with these, there's a side that has a flat edge and a side that has a beveled edge. We want to use the beveled edge for the face of the canvas. So this side, which usually has the sticker on it, that's kind of another giveaway. That's going to be the back of our canvas. Some women are barefoot in the kitchen. I'm barefoot in the studio. Okay. Take our square and check this one. All right, that looks pretty good. So next we can move on and add our linen. All right, let's take our canvases and line them up here. We want to make sure there's about 2 inches at least, or 1.5 inches of edge all the way around each canvas. Maybe even a little extra for this larger one here. And then I'll take a straight edge and a little charcoal pencil and mark my edges all the way around here so that I get a nice clean straight edge. We can take our linen, roll it back up. All right, now it's time to stretch our canvases. And I'm going to do these 2 different ways. For my large canvas, I'm going to prepare it with the traditional rabbit skin glue. And for the smaller canvas, I'm going to use an acrylic polymer to prepare it. So just something to keep in mind when you're stretching your canvases, you're going to want to make sure that you're stretching them for whatever size you plan to use. The main difference being with the rabbit skin glue, it tightens your canvas so tight that as you're stretching it, you want to make sure you actually leave a little bit of room for it to stretch, and that way the stretcher bars don't get warped. So we're not going to stretch it as tight as you would if you're using an acrylic polymer. In that case, you want to make it as tight as possible while you're stapling the linen to the back of your stretcher bars. So that is the main difference. First of all, make sure it's straight all the way around, and then place a staple in the center, going to each opposite side. And then all the way around. I move around a lot during this process, which is why I'm doing this on the floor. It's just easier. Okay, so there's quite a bit of bounce there, and that's okay because I'm going to do rabbit skin glue on this one, and that's going to make it super tight. So from there, working out from the center staple, I'm going to go about 2 inches out, grab a little bit of that linen and pull, and then staple. And then I continue all the way around on the opposite sides until I get to the corners. Once you get to the outer corners, it's important to fold them over neatly. So I'm going to finish stapling this edge right here all the way over, and then I'm going to take my corner and fold it. So this top flap folds down and then back and around and over like that. And then I'll staple that. Honestly, as much as I love a good commercially prepared canvas, there's nothing more exciting than working on one that I've made myself from scratch. I still haven't found anything better to work on. All right, there you go. There's our 24 by 30. It's ready to go. And once our RSG is ready to apply, we'll be able to use that. Now let's move on to the smaller canvas. These have the same kind of bevel on them on both sides, so they don't really matter as much as those larger stretcher bars. Same thing, you want to start from the center and work your way out. This time I'm going to pull a little bit harder and tug it as tight as I can, because I know that I'm planning to use the acrylic polymer to size this, and for whatever reason it's good stuff, but it just doesn't go as tight as the RSG. Once in a while, a staple will do something like this. If that happens, just pull it out with the pliers and start over, because it's not really in there tight enough to do its job. Okay, same thing with the corners. Get them nice and tight, and then do your nice little fold over. You see that? Okay, there we go. If you have these little strings on the back, you can just trim those off with your scissors. There it is, nice and tight, ready to go. All right, for this last panel that we have, where we're going to mount linen to it, I'm going to use some of that thicker textured linen for that. And the only thing I need to do to prepare this, as we're waiting for the rabbit skin glue, is to just cut out a piece that will fit over the top of this that has about 1 inch of excess all the way around. Because once we apply the linen and the size, the linen's going to shrink on the panel. So just make sure there's some excess, otherwise it's not going to go all the way to the edge. So let's go ahead and cut out our piece for this. All right. Okay, it's day 2 here in the kitchen. I've let my rabbit skin glue soak overnight, and the granules are now nice and swollen. They're not fully dissolved yet, so I'm going to turn on my stove here, and we'll set it to maybe medium low or low, and we're going to let that heat up until it's warm. The purpose of the double boiler is to make sure that our glue solution doesn't boil. We want to make sure that it's only heated up slowly and gradually so it's nice and warm. But if it boils, it loses its properties as an adhesive. So it shouldn't take too long, maybe about 20-30 minutes, and then it'll be ready to brush onto our canvas. Okay, that looks pretty good. I've been stirring it occasionally and making sure that those granules get fully dissolved. And if you wanted to, you could let it sit for a little bit and cool off before we brush it on. We don't want it to be boiling hot or too hot to touch, but it's pretty much ready to go. So let's take this down to the studio. All right, I've got my canvas here ready to go. It's sitting out on some cardboard, and this is where it's going to, this is basically going to be our working surface for the rest of this process. And I'm going to go ahead and dip my little chip brush in the mixture, and I'm going to start in the very center of the canvas. And the key to proper application of rabbit skin glue is to make sure that you're going in outward circles from the center out, and keep it really nice and thin. And it's also helpful, finding hairs in my canvas here, helpful to just brush off any debris or hair that is maybe settled on the surface of the canvas before you start. You know, for all the talk about RSG being maybe not as conservation friendly, you know, many of the paintings you see in museums were prepared with this stuff, and they've lasted really, really well. And I think maybe the key is to just store your paintings in a place where the temperature and the humidity are staying consistent. You know, don't store them in a damp basement. Really, the only time I've personally seen the negative effects of RSG being hygroscopic, there was one incident where I really saw what that meant. Years and years ago, when I was just getting started in my career, I went through a phase where I was trying to sell my work at outdoor art festivals. And for these kinds of events, you have, you know, a tent, and you have these carpeted portable panels that you hang your paintings on, and then the tent and your whole setup stays there for like 2 or 3 days for the duration of the festival. Well, this was when I was living back in Texas, and if you've ever been to Texas, you know that spring and summer can be extremely humid. And one evening there was a thunderstorm, and when I came back to my booth the next morning, one of my paintings that had been prepared this way with stretch linen and RSG Well, it was all warped and wrinkled, and I was absolutely mortified. So I ended up taking it down and bringing it home, and thankfully, when it returned to a stable environment, it tightened right back up and it looked great, and I was able to sell it later on. But I learned the hard way that if I wanted to be making these paintings on stretch canvases, well, then maybe it wasn't a good idea to try and display them in an outdoor art festival. And that's why when you see artists doing plein air events, they typically work on rigid surfaces. So the moral of the story is just don't let your paintings sit out overnight. All right, so we made it all the way to the edge there. Now we're going to do the sides. Oh, did you hear that? Already tight as a drum. It's one of my favorite sounds. So the key is to try to get a nice, smooth, even, and thin coat all the way around. The glue should soak through. It should permeate the fibers. That's the whole point, is that it's protecting the fibers from subsequent layers of oil that we're going to put on this. So rabbit skin glue is really amazing stuff, and even though, you know, it does respond to environmental factors, sometimes that can be a good thing. And the thing is, it's flexible, so it allows for this really wonderful, tight, flexible surface to work on, and it moves with that surface. And then additionally, you know, in art museums, when they restore paintings that are prepared with this stuff, it's kind of cool. If they need to remove the canvas that it was painted on, and the canvas itself is starting to rot a little bit, the rabbit skin glue causes such an effective barrier that the paint and the size can actually be removed from the canvas separately, and then reapplied to a brand new canvas. So honestly, I don't know how many of us are going to get to that point where we have paintings in museums that are being restored by conservationists, but hey, it's something to work towards. Chances are that'll be hundreds of years from now, and by then we really won't care. Okay, next I'm going to show you how I would apply this sheet of raw linen to a wooden panel. And you can size the wooden panel with your rabbit skin glue. So we'll put a real thin coat directly onto the panel. And you don't need to wait for this to dry. This is really just our first layer here, just to ensure that we cover the whole surface. So when I make a batch of rabbit skin glue, I'm usually doing several canvases at once, just to make sure I don't waste my product. And you know, let's be honest, it takes time to make, so we might as well do a big batch. Okay, so I've got a nice thin, even layer on my board. Now I'm going to take my linen, and then I'm just going to lay it on the top with that little bit of excess all the way around the edge. And then I'm going to take my rabbit skin glue and start in the center again. And this time I'm going to need a little bit more of it to really get in there, because this is that thicker, lower thread count linen. And we're just going to brush that on vigorously from the center going outwards. And we really want it to soak into that fiber. We're also making sure as we do this that any air bubbles that might come up are getting brushed off towards the outer edges. So if you have wrinkles in your linen or something like that, those will go away once you add your size. But you'll notice it start to warp a little bit or have these little bubbles or wrinkles at the edges, and so we're pushing out with our brush to get rid of those and make sure those don't stay on our canvas. So this takes just a little bit of extra muscle here. And make sure as you work out that you get all the way to the edge and that you're using a good amount of glue at the edge so that it's adhering fully in spite of those bubbles that want to form. And for each of our canvases today, we're going to need 2 coats of rabbit skin glue. And you'll want to sand the first coat after it's dry, but don't sand the second coat because that's going to provide a little bit of grit for our primer to cling to and give it that extra bit of friction that it needs to stay adhered to the canvas. And just like anything else, you know, it's better to have several really thin coats of size than to have one really thick coat. It's going to be a lot more effective if you can have the patience to just take your time and do it properly. And I say this because I've learned pretty much everything the hard way. Made a lot of mistakes. Sometimes it can help once you're done. If it seems like it's still wanting to lift up at the corners, you can take something heavy and weigh down the corners just to make sure that that doesn't keep lifting up. You can do the same with the stretched canvas as well. Okay, we're done with the first coat of the rabbit skin glue. I'm just going to give the canvases about half a day or so to dry. Depending on the humidity levels of your studio, it could take longer or shorter. But you just want to make sure that those wet patches are all gone and that the canvas is back to kind of that uniform light gray color that it was before we got it wet with the glue. Now the glue is going to return to sort of a gel-like state, and that's fine. We can just go ahead and reheat it on the double boiler when we're ready for our second coat. And in the meantime, we'll just go ahead and let those dry. And I'm going to wash my brush with soap and water. And yeah, we'll be back in a little bit. Okay, I'm back and I'm taking a look at my canvas. It's been about, I want to say it's been about 6 to 8 hours since I put the first coat of rabbit skin glue on this. And you can see there's still one slightly little tacky spot here. That's okay. The other thing that you might notice after the first coat is that there might be a couple of little bumps or wrinkles. But usually those will go away after the second coat. And if you still have some after the second coat, a third coat should do it. And I know this from experience. So the first thing I'm going to do before I go ahead and put on the second coat of glue is I'm going to take the fine grained sandpaper and sand gently to make sure that I'm getting rid of some of the roughness that's caused by that first coat. Yeah, you can see kind of some of the wrinkles on the backside here, but like I said, with that second coat, that should do the trick. Pro tip: after brushing the RSG on the sides of your canvas, go back and look for overspill at the corners and smooth that out. Something I should mention is that RSG is much more stable when it's used in this way over a rigid support. So if you would like to try this option for sizing, I really recommend it. All right, let's not forget about my other stretched canvas, the smaller one. I'm treating this one with a completely different type of size than the rabbit skin glue. And instead I'm using acrylic polymers, which are considered technically more archival because they aren't susceptible to humidity. So here I have my GAC400. As I mentioned earlier, I stretched this canvas extra tight so there was no slack in it. And I'm going to use 1 coat of GAC400 followed by 2 coats of GAC100 for this one. Now the GAC400 helps stiffen and tighten the fabric even more, but keep in mind it's not the actual size since it doesn't really serve as an adequate barrier for oil paint. Instead, the GAC100 is going to be our protective layer. You can brush this on however you want, just make sure you're working it well into the fibers and keeping it fairly smooth. It's going to dry clear, and once you've applied a generous amount to both the front and the sides, let it dry for several hours. Then you can go in with your first coat of GAC100. And just like the rabbit skin glue, I like to gently sand in between coats. So here I have my GAC100. I've talked about this quite a bit in my other videos on oil painting surfaces, and this product really is a wonderful product. As long as your canvas is stretched extra tight, like I mentioned before, it makes a great size. You notice as I'm brushing it on, the canvas start to warp and dip in the middle just a little bit, so it does have some slack. That should tighten back up as the GAC100 dries. So I put a pretty generous amount on there and try to smooth it out and go in one direction for my first coat and the opposite direction for the second coat. And of course I'm making sure that I'm thoroughly covering the sides and then brushing away any overlap or spills or drips that happen from brushing the sides like that. Once your 2 coats of GAC100 are dry, you could actually work on your canvas directly like this. It's totally safe to use with oils or acrylics, and it's kind of neat to have that linen color as you're underpainting. So some people like to leave it right here, others prefer the smoothness of a clean white gesso over the top, but I'm going to leave this one the way it is because I really like how it looks and it's going to be fun to paint on. Okay, here we are. Our canvases have had a good 24 hours to dry, and they are tight as a drum. Listen to this. That's a good sound. If you look at the back, nice and smooth, the wrinkles are gone. So it looks like 2 coats of rabbit skin glue was all we needed to make our canvas perfectly sized and perfectly taut. So the next step is priming. So here I've got some lead oil ground for priming our canvas, and sometimes you can get this stuff in a paste, which means you would just need to mix it up with a little bit of solvent to make it a little bit more brushable. But if you buy just the ground like this, it's ready to go, ready to brush on. It does need to be stirred when you open it. I've got mine stirred and I'm ready to brush it on. Now, something to keep in mind when you're applying this stuff, do a nice thin coat, make it smooth and uniform. Lead ground, you don't want to sand between coats. It's not safe. And so I'm going to try to do as good of a job applying it as possible. And for this, it doesn't matter as much how you put it on as long as it's nice and smooth. Doesn't matter if you start in the center or on the edges, but if you want a really uniform surface to work on, it's good to go one direction for your first coat and then a perpendicular direction for your second coat. You know what? I forgot to do this, but I'm going to put my gloves on just to make sure none of this is actually coming in contact with my skin. And then another thing I should mention real quick here, I have a really well ventilated space that I'm doing this in. I'm doing this in my basement, and I have doors and windows open, as well as just a lot of square footage. So if you're going to be using lead, I do recommend that you put this on either outdoors or in a space where you have a really good ventilation system. If you don't have a well ventilated space, make sure you wear a respirator mask, which you can find at your local hardware store. The garage is actually a great place to do this, or if you have to do this in your studio, do it at the end of the workday and shut the door when you're done, because the fumes will linger for several hours. All right, that's pretty good. I'm just gonna smooth out a couple little spots here. One little tip for you is if you happen to have just little brush hairs or pieces of debris that end up on your canvas while you're doing this process, you can just use the kind of bristles of your brush to gently lift those out and then pull those off, or with your rubber gloved hand. And that's another reason why I wear the rubber gloves, so that if I need to pick something off of the canvas or pick up the canvas to rotate it to get the sides, then I'm not getting it all over my hands. So we'll let this dry for probably a few days. Depends again on humidity levels in your house or your studio. But we'll give it a few days and then we'll test it to see how dry it is before we give it its second coat. One way that you can test it is to just do a little thumbnail test. You can test a little section and see if it leaves an indent. If it's still kind of tacky, then it's probably not ready to go. But if it doesn't leave a mark, then it'll be ready for the second coat. Last but not least, we have our wood panel that we mounted raw linen to using the rabbit skin glue. And for this one, instead of using the lead ground or GAC100, I'm going to use just a titanium oil ground. And it's very buttery, straight out of the can, but it is rather thick. So I'm using a large putty knife to smooth it onto the canvas. And the important part about this first coat is just making sure that I'm getting as much of the primer as possible into those grains of linen and working it into the fibers. And this does take some time and a little bit of muscle. If you find that the consistency is way too thick, you can take some Gamsol or thinner and use a brush to just brush some of that thinner into the primer, and that should smooth it out a little bit. As you can see, I'm just trying to cover the surface as much as I can with the putty knife first, and then I'll go in with my brush and smooth the texture just a whole lot more with the brush afterwards. So you can see I've gotten the Gamsol out, and I'm just dipping my chip brush in there very gently and then using that little bit that's on my brush to smooth out the texture and just make sure that it's uniform all the way across. And this does take some time, but it's worth it. You do want it to dry as evenly as possible and make sure that there aren't any areas that are a whole lot thicker than others. So putting a little bit of muscle into it, also making sure I get all the way to the edge of the board. Even though there's that overlap of the linen, you can tell by feel where the edge of the board is, and of course I want to make sure I get all the way to the edges. Here's a tip for you. Store your priming brush in a Ziploc freezer bag and place it in the freezer so that you don't have to clean it in between coats. Once you're done with your whole batch of canvases, you can clean it thoroughly using mineral spirits or the solvent of your choice. Okay, once you're done with your second coat of primer, I think it's a good idea to label the back of your canvas with the kind of size and primer that you used. So in this case, I would write on the back, just with a Sharpie or something, that I used 2 coats of rabbit skin glue and 2 coats of lead ground. That way, for future reference, I'll know what I had, and if conservationists ever need to fix my painting for any reason, they'll know what I used. After you've done your second coat of oil ground on your linen panel and that coat is fully dry, tested of course using your little thumbnail test, then the fun part. You can slice off those ragged edges and get it nice and flush all the way around using your X-Acto knife, and then I like to sand it one more time before painting on it just to make sure I get it the right level of smoothness. But with the 2 coats of RSG and the 2 coats of oil ground, this really ends up being one of my favorite surfaces to work on. And there's nothing more satisfying than trimming off those ragged edges, turning it over, and seeing your own homemade linen panel. So just a recap on the 3 canvases that we've made today. Canvas number 1, our big canvas. We used heavy-duty stretcher bars, a fine weave portrait-grade linen, 2 coats of rabbit skin glue, and 2 coats of lead oil ground. For canvas number 2, our small canvas, we used light-duty stretcher bars, our fine weave raw linen, 1 coat of GAC400 followed by 2 coats of GAC100. Canvas number 3 is our panel. We used an unprimed wood panel, medium weave raw linen, 2 coats of rabbit skin glue, and 2 coats of titanium oil ground. Each of these surfaces is fabulous to work on, and while I know it seems like a lot of work up front, you'll find, I think, once you start getting into the groove of making big batches of these things that it's kind of fun and customizable, and eventually you'll figure out what really works for you and what you enjoy painting on. And honestly, there's nothing more rewarding than working on a surface you've made all on your own from scratch. So give it a try and let me know what you think.